Clara Whitmore dropped to her knees in the mud, without thinking twice, not because she was brave, not because she was noble, but because an old woman was crying in the dark, and nobody else had stopped. Behind her, every silk dress in Virginia was rushing toward the most powerful man in the county. Ahead of her was nothing but rain, shadow, and a stranger who had fallen alone. She chose the stranger. She had no idea that single choice would unravel every lie, every scheme, and every carefully arranged future that the wealthy families of Richmond had spent years building around her. If this kind of story speaks to your heart, please subscribe to our channel and follow along until the very end and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story has traveled. Virginia. Summer, 1817. The storm came in fast that evening, the way Virginia storms always did, without warning and without mercy. One moment the sky above Richmond was bruised purple and gold from a dying sun. The next the rain was everywhere, hammering the dirt roads into rivers of red mud, bending the tall grass flat along the fence lines, sending every sensible person running for cover. Clara Whitmore was not running for cover. She was walking toward Caldwell Manor with her chin up and her jaw set, her good blue dress already soaked through at the shoulders, her only decent pair of shoes sinking half an inch into the road with every step. She had repaired that dress 3 times this past month alone, let out the seams twice, re-stitched the collar where it had begun to fray, pressed it with a flat iron until the fabric lay smooth and respectable against her skin. She had no silk, she had no pearls, she had a clean dress and clean hands and a quiet, stubborn dignity that no amount of rain was going to wash away. She had been invited to Caldwell Manor the same way. Every unmarried woman in the county had been invited through the general announcement, posted outside the Richmond courthouse. The one that had been copied by hand and spread from household to household until every family with a daughter of marrying age had read it twice. Nathaniel Caldwell, heir to the largest private landholding in 3 counties and the most discussed man in Virginia society, was receiving guests at his family estate. There would be music, there would be dancing, there would be opportunity. Clara had no illusions about what kind of opportunity a seamstress's daughter was likely to find at an event like this one. She was not foolish. She understood the world she lived in well enough to know that men like Nathaniel Caldwell did not marry women like her. But her employer, Mrs. Ruth Harding, had pressed the matter with unusual force that morning. "You go," Ruth had said, slapping a hand against the cutting table between them. "You dress yourself up and you go, Clara. You are 26 years old. You cannot spend every evening of your life in this shop with your nose over a needle." "I like my needle," Clara had said, without looking up. "Your needle will not keep you warm in 30 years. I have a quilt." Clara. She had looked up then, because Ruth only used that particular tone, flat and final and slightly wounded, when she meant business. Ruth Harding was 53 years old and had been widowed for 11 of those years, and had spent the better part of a decade watching Clara use every polite excuse available to avoid precisely this kind of situation. Ruth had run out of patience. "Fine," Clara had said. "I'll go." She had not gone expecting anything. She had gone because Ruth had asked her to. And because some quiet part of her, the part she did not examine too closely, was tired of pretending she felt nothing when she watched other women her age walk down church aisles in borrowed veils and borrowed hope. She went the way she did most things, practically, without sentiment, and prepared to be disappointed. She had not expected the storm. She had not expected, either, the sound she heard as she came around the bend in the road, where the old stone wall marked the edge of the Caldwell property, that low, thin sound that was not quite a cry and not quite a moan, but something in between. The sound of a person who had been hurting for a while and had given up expecting anyone to come. Clara stopped walking. Around her the road was not empty. There were other women ahead of her, skirts lifted against the mud, moving quickly toward the lights of the manor house. A carriage rolled past without slowing. 2 young women she recognized from the milliner's shop on Broad Street hurried by, their heads bent against the rain, talking to each other in sharp, excited whispers. Nobody else stopped. Clara turned her head toward the wall. In the mud beside the crumbling stone, Half hidden by a tangle of wet ivy, an old woman was sitting, or rather, had collapsed against the base of the wall with her legs stretched out in front of her and her back hunched forward, and a broken basket lying beside her, its contents scattered, a handful of dried herbs, a bundle of cloth, a small glass jar now half filled with rainwater. She was old. 70, perhaps more. Her hair was white and soaked flat against her head. Her dress was plain too plain for this road on this night, the dress of a woman who worked rather than one who attended events. Her hands, resting in the mud beside the basket, were shaking. Clara walked toward her without making the decision consciously. One moment she was standing still. The next she was moving, crossing the few feet of distance between the road and the wall, and then she was crouching down in the mud beside the old woman with her good dress sinking into the wet earth around her knees. "Ma'am." Clara kept her voice low and steady. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" The old woman opened her eyes. They were dark and sharp and, despite everything, not afraid, just exhausted in the way that pain makes a person exhausted, bone deep and pulling. "Go away, child," the woman said. Her voice was rougher than Clara expected. "Not weak, just worn. You assessing your chance." "There will be other chances," Clara said. She glanced at the woman's left ankle, which was angled in a way that made her stomach tighten. "Can you move your foot?" The old woman tried. Her face didn't change much, but her hands pressed harder into the mud. "Twisted," Clara said. "Not a question. How long have you been sitting here?" "Long enough to know that everyone who passed had somewhere more important to be." "Well," Clara said, "I don't." She gathered the key to contents of the basket first, working quickly, tucking the herbs and the cloth and the little jar back in as best she could. Then she got one arm under the old woman's shoulders and assessed the situation with the calm, practical part of her mind that had been managing difficult situations since she was 11 years old, and her mother had taken sick and her father's hands had started to shake too badly to hold a needle. "I'm going to help you stand," Clara said. "You lean your weight on me as much as you need to. Don't try to be polite about it." The old woman made a sound that might have been a laugh. "Polite? Huh, is there somewhere close you can shelter? A house nearby?" "The cottage," the woman said, "just past the wall." Through the gate. Clara hadn't noticed the gate before. It was iron old, set into the stone wall and almost entirely hidden by the overgrowth of ivy. But it was there, and when Clara got the old woman on her feet slowly, carefully, taking the weight she was offered, without flinching, she could see a faint light burning through the trees on the other side. They moved slowly. The old woman said nothing about the pain, but Clara felt it in the grip of her fingers on Clara's arm, in the careful, controlled way she held her breath with each step. Clara talked to fill the silence, not about anything important, just words, something steady to hold on to. "The storms here come up fast," she said. "Back home we used to say you could tell by the smell of the air about an hour before. That particular smell, like copper and soil together. My father taught me that." "Your father was a farmer?" "A tailor, but he grew up on a farm outside Fredericksburg." She unlatched the gate one-handed without breaking stride. "He said a tailor who doesn't know anything about weather is a tailor who runs out of waterproofing thread at the wrong moment." Another sound from the old woman, definitely a laugh this time. The cottage was small and had been well made once, though it wanted attention now. The window frames needed paint, the door hinges needed oil. The garden in front had been tended with real love at some point in the past and had now gone half to seed. Clara noticed all of this automatically, the way she noticed loose threads and uneven hems, cataloging without judgment. She got the old woman through the door and into the single chair beside the cold fireplace, and then immediately turned her attention to the fireplace itself, which had laid wood and dry tinder stacked beside it. "I can manage," the old woman said. "You can," Clara agreed pleasantly and lit the fire anyway. She found a cloth and filled a basin from the water pump in the kitchen and brought it back to where the old woman sat. And she cleaned the mud from the woman's hands and examined the ankle with careful fingers and established that it was twisted but not broken, and then she bound it neatly with a strip of cloth from her own petticoat, which was already ruined from the mud and might as well be useful. The old woman watched her throughout all of this with those sharp, dark eyes. "You are not going to ask who I am," she said. Clara tied off the bandage. "It's not my business who you are, ma'am. It's my business that your ankle is wrapped and the fire is lit." "Most people would ask. Most people walked past you in the rain," Clara said and stood up. "Would you like me to make you some tea? I saw dried chamomile in your basket." The old woman was quiet for a moment, then she said very quietly, "Yes." "Thank you." Her name, Clara learned over the course of the next hour, was Margaret. She did not offer a family name, and Clara did not ask for one. She was 72 years old, and she lived alone in the cottage, and she had, she said, been to the kitchen garden on the far side of the estate wall to collect herbs and had come back via the road, rather than the back path, because she'd wanted to see the lights of the manor house for a minute just to see them, and the storm had come up faster than she'd anticipated, and her ankle had gone out from under her on the wet stones. "You live alone?" Clara said. She was sitting on the small footstool she'd pulled up beside the chair, her ruined dress steaming slightly in the warmth of the fire, the tea made and cooling in its cups. "I prefer it," Margaret said. A pause. "Family is complicated." Clara nodded. She understood that well enough. "Do you have someone who can come check on you? A neighbor? A servant from the estate?" "Someone will come," Margaret said. "In the morning." "I am not entirely without resources." She tilted her head. "You missed the party. I expect so. Does that trouble you?" Clara considered the question honestly, which was how she considered most things. "A little," she admitted. "Mrs. Harding wanted me to go." "She'll be disappointed." And I suppose I'd thought she stopped. "You'd thought what?" Clara looked at the fire. "I'd thought maybe it would be nice to go to something like that. To feel for one evening like I was." She shook her head. "It doesn't matter. Wishes like that aren't practical." "Wishes are never practical," Margaret said. "That is rather the point of them." Clara smiled, despite herself. "Do you always talk like that?" "Like what? Like every sentence is a lesson." Margaret's mouth curved. "I have had 72 years to collect them. I see no reason to waste them." Clara stayed until she was certain the fire was burning well, and the tea had been drunk, and the old woman's color had come back to something closer to normal. She gathered her ruined shoes and her soaked-through basket. She had brought a gift for the Caldwell party, a small jar of preserved fruit that Ruth had pressed on her, which was now sitting on Margaret's kitchen shelf because it had seemed rude to bring it back, and she prepared to leave. "You never told me your name," Margaret said from the chair. "Clara Whitmore," Clara said. "My shop is on Merchant Street." "Ruth Harding's. I know the shop." Something moved in Margaret's expression, recognition, or something close to it. "Clara Whitmore." She said the name as though she were placing it somewhere. "You made the blue dress yourself?" "I always make my own." "The stitching on the bodice is very fine." Clara looked down at the ruined dress. "It was," she said, and she laughed. Margaret laughed too. And for a moment the rain hammered the cottage windows, and the fire crackled, and two women 72 years old and 26. As different in circumstance as any two women in Virginia could reasonably be sat in a small room and laughed together at a muddy dress and a wasted evening, and it was the most comfortable Clara had felt in months. She walked home in the rain. She didn't mind. She did not think much about the evening when she woke the next morning. She thought about the basket she needed to repair, and the 3 dresses waiting for her on the work table, and whether she had enough of the dark blue, worsted to finish Mrs. Patterson's order by Thursday. She made her coffee and she sat at the table, and she worked through her list of what needed doing, and Margaret Holloway was just at the edge of her mind, a warm, pleasant memory, not a puzzle. Then Ruth came in, still in her morning shawl, and said, "I heard you didn't make it to the party last night." "The storm," Clara said. "Caroline Ashford said she saw you helping someone on the road." An old woman had fallen. She'd twisted her ankle. Ruth sat down across from her. Her face was doing something complicated that Clara couldn't quite read. "Who was she?" She said her name was Margaret. She lives in the cottage just inside the Caldwell estate wall, the one through the iron gate. Ruth's coffee cup stopped halfway to her mouth. "The Gate Cottage," she said. Do you know it? Ruth put her cup down very carefully. Clara, she said, that cottage belongs to the Caldwell family. It's been maintained, for she stopped. Do you know who lives there? Margaret, Clara said. She's 72, she lives alone. She was going to her kitchen garden when Margaret Holloway, Ruth said. Her name is Margaret Holloway. Clara waited. She is Nathaniel Caldwell's grandmother, Ruth said. His mother's mother. She has lived in that cottage for 30 years. She came to live there after her husband died, and she has never, Ruth shook her head. She is very private, very private. Nobody goes to that cottage. She does not receive visitors. Clara looked at her coffee. She seemed perfectly happy to receive a visitor last night, she said. She drank tea and told me things. Clara, what? Ruth pressed her lips together. She was clearly trying to decide how much to say. The Caldwell family, Clara. Do you understand what that means? I understand it means a very old woman fell in the mud in the rain, and nobody stopped to help her, Clara said. Which is what I understood last night, too. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she sighed, the particular sigh that meant she had decided Clara was impossible, and she was going to love her anyway. Is she well? Ruth asked. The ankle will need a few days. She had good color by the time I left. She's got someone coming in the morning, she said. Yes, she will. She will have the household in a state. Ruth picked up her coffee again. She will probably also ask after you. Clara shook her head. She's not going to remember some seamstress who brought her tea. Ruth looked at her over the rim of her cup, with an expression that Clara couldn't interpret, something between amusement and a very specific kind of knowing. No, Ruth said slowly. I'm quite sure you're right. Margaret Holloway remembered. 3 days after the storm, a letter arrived at the shop on Merchant Street, not delivered by post, but by a very correct-looking young man who handed it to Clara directly and waited while she read it, as though he expected a reply immediately. The letter was written in a hand that was elegant and slightly shaky, and entirely characteristic of a woman who had been writing letters all her life and was not about to stop because of a twisted ankle. Miss Whitmore, I find myself in need of someone to look at the garden. The iris beds along the south wall have not been properly tended in 2 years, and I have been told repeatedly that I cannot do it myself until this wretched ankle cooperates. I am told also that you have a good eye and a willingness to work, which is more than can be said for most of the people who are paid to do so. I would like you to come Thursday if you are not otherwise engaged. I cannot pay you in anything except conversation and possibly tea, which I am told is an insufficient wage. But I suspect you will come anyway. M.H. Clara read it twice. She read it a third time. Then she looked at the young man waiting at the door. Tell her yes, she said. She went on Thursday. And on the following Thursday, and the Thursday after that. The garden was real work. The iris beds were genuinely overgrown. The stone paths were cracked and needed weeding. The climbing roses along the back wall had not been cut back properly in at least 1 season, and had begun to assert themselves with considerable enthusiasm over everything within reach. Clara worked on her knees in the dirt, and Margaret sat in the chair she'd had carried out to the garden, and she watched and she talked. She talked about the garden as it had been, where each plant had been placed and why, what had grown well and what had struggled, the particular personality of each bed. She talked about Virginia and how it had changed in her lifetime. She talked about her husband, briefly, with a precision that suggested the grief had been lived with long enough to become something she could hold steadily without needing to put it down. She talked about her daughter Nathaniel's mother, who had died when Nathaniel was 15, and about that she talked even more briefly, in a way that made Clara feel the weight of it without any additional words. Clara talked too, not as much, but Margaret had a way of asking questions that made answering feel less like disclosure and more like conversation. Clara talked about her father and the tailor shop, and the years after he died, when she had been 19 and had had to decide what to do with everything he'd left her, not money. There wasn't much of that, but skill and tools and a name people in Richmond trusted when they brought in their good fabric. Were you angry? Margaret asked one Thursday afternoon. When he died. "I was scared," she said. There wasn't much room left for angry, and now? Now I'm not scared. She sat back on her heels and looked at the row she'd just cleared. Mostly. Margaret studied her for a long moment. "You are a great deal more honest than most people," she said. "Mrs. Harding says it's my worst quality. Mrs. Harding is wrong. It is your best one." It was on the fourth Thursday early August, the heat bearing down in the sparkler birthday waited in Virginia. Summer stopped being polite that Clara arrived at the cottage and found someone else there. He was standing in the garden near the roses, his back to her, and he was tall and had dark hair and was dressed simply, not a work shirt, but not the elaborate formality she associated with men of consequence either. Just a good linen shirt and plain dark trousers, and the posture of a man who was accustomed to standing in this garden and did not feel the need to announce himself. Margaret was in her chair. She looked at Clara when Clara came through the gate, and her expression was not guilty. Margaret did not do guilty, but something aware. Something that had anticipated this. "Clara," she said. "Come and meet someone." The man turned around. He was perhaps 34, brown-eyed, with a face that was not classically handsome, not the kind of face that made people stop in the street, but a face that had something in it, some quality of attention, as though whatever he was looking at had his full regard. He looked at Clara with that quality now, and Clara felt, unexpectedly, the faint prickling sensation of being genuinely seen. "This is Nathan," Margaret said, "an old friend of the family." He extended his hand. "Miss Whitmore." His voice was even measured. "Not warm exactly, but not cold interested. My grandmother speaks highly of you." Clara shook his hand, then she registered the word. She looked at Margaret. Margaret met her look with perfect composure. "Your grandmother," Clara said. "My grandmother," he confirmed. "She tells me you've been coming to work on the garden every Thursday for a month." "She tells me you've been too busy to visit in 6 weeks, Clara said before she'd fully decided to say it. A silence. Margaret made a sound that was clearly a cough covering a laugh. Nathan looked at Clara for a moment longer than was strictly comfortable. Then the corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. "But close. She told me that too," he said, among other things. "I should get started," Clara said, because the ground felt suddenly less stable than it had a moment ago, and work was always reliable ground. "The east bed needs attention." She took her tools and went to the east bed, and she worked, and she was very deliberate about not looking toward the 2 chairs, where Nathan and Margaret had settled into conversation, and she was only partially successful. She heard his voice, not the words, just the tone, which shifted when he talked to Margaret in a way that made something in her chest do something she chose not to examine. She heard Margaret's occasional, sharp reply and his laugh in response, low and genuine. She worked. She did not look. At some point he appeared beside the east bed. "Can I help?" he asked. "Do you know what you're doing?" "No," he said with complete honesty. "Then you can hand me things," Clara said. "And try not to pull up anything that isn't a weed." He crouched down beside her, which she had not expected, and he did exactly what she'd told him, handed her things when she reached for them, asked when he wasn't sure if something was a weed, listened when she explained. "How do you know," he asked at one point, "the difference?" "Practice," she said, "and the shape of the leaves. Weeds tend to be pushy. They grow in the wrong places and crowd everything else." She sat back. "Most things that don't belong somewhere eventually make their discomfort obvious." He was quiet for a moment. "That's an interesting way to think about it." "It's a practical way to think about it. Most people would have said it's a metaphor for something. Most people look for metaphors in everything." She pulled a particularly aggressive runner of clover. "Sometimes a weed is just a weed." He smiled at that. The full version this time. Clara looked away. She went home that Thursday evening, with dirt under her fingernails and a quiet, persistent unease she couldn't quite locate. Not uncomfortable, exactly, just the feeling of something having shifted slightly. The way a room looks different when a piece of furniture has been moved, and you can't immediately identify which piece. She mentioned none of it to Ruth. He was there the following Thursday, and the one after that. He never announced he would be coming. He never announced much of anything. He simply appeared, with that quality of attention already in place, and he would work in the garden alongside her, and talk when she wanted to talk, and be quiet when she didn't, and argue when she said something he disagreed with, which he did without hesitation and without apology, which she respected even when it irritated her. He argued with her about everything, about the right way to stake the roses, about whether the lavender bed should be moved, about the proper role of county government in maintaining the roads, about whether the novel she'd mentioned reading last week had a satisfying ending. It wasn't satisfying, he said. The ending was convenient. Convenient endings are satisfying, Clara said. That's the point of them. If you want to be satisfied with convenience, I want to be satisfied at the end of a book I've spent 2 weeks reading. Yes. You want the feeling of satisfaction, he said. That's different from satisfaction being earned. Clara looked at him. Do you argue about everything? Only the things that are worth arguing about. How do you know which ones those are? If I don't care either way, I don't bother, he said simply. If I'm arguing, it means the answer matters. She thought about that on the walk home. She thought about it longer than she meant to. Margaret watched all of this from her chair with her sharp dark eyes and said nothing directly, which was, Clara was slowly learning how Margaret operated when she was most interested in an outcome. One Thursday evening in late August, when Clara was washing her hands at the pump and Nathan was returning the tools to the shed, Margaret said, quietly and without preamble, "He has not laughed like that since before his mother died." Clara straightened, dried her hands. Like what? Like himself, Margaret said. Not performed, not managed. She looked at the shed door. He does not have very many people in his life who speak to him the way you do. I talk to him the same way I talk to everyone. I know, Margaret said. That is what is unusual about it. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Margaret, who is he exactly? Margaret met her eyes. And in that look Clara read not evasion but decision. A deliberate choice being made. He is a man who has been lonely for a long time, Margaret said. That is the most important thing. That's not an answer. It's the truest one I have. The shed door opened and Nathan came out, and Margaret's face shifted into something ordinary, and the moment was over, and Clara gathered her things and said her goodbyes, and walked home in the last light of the August evening. And the unease that had been sitting quiet at the edge of her mind for weeks had grown into something considerably louder. She did not know who he was, not precisely, but she knew he was not what he had presented himself as, not merely an old friend of the family, not an ordinary man. She knew this, the way she knew a fabric's quality before she read the label, by the weight of it, by the way it held itself, by the small careful ways he sometimes caught and corrected himself mid-sentence. She was not naive. She was 26 years old, and she had been reading people her whole life, the way people who don't have money learn to do, quickly and accurately and without the luxury of being wrong. She knew. She just hadn't said so yet, and she went on Thursdays because the garden was real, and the work was real, and Margaret was real, and whatever else was complicated, those three things were solid ground. She went, and she worked, and she listened to Nathan argue about roses and road management, and whether satisfaction was the same as convenience. And she did not examine too carefully the fact that she looked forward to Thursdays more than she'd looked forward to anything in a very long time. And the summer moved through its long days, and the question that Clara had not yet asked kept building quietly toward its answer. The first time Nathan Caldwell lied to Clara Whitmore, he told himself it wasn't a lie at all. It was an omission, a delay, a temporary withholding of information that would complicate something he wasn't ready to complicate. He had been telling himself this for 6 Thursdays running, and he was getting considerably less convincing at it. He knew this because Margaret had looked at him across the breakfast table that morning and said, without any introduction, "You need to tell her." "Good morning to you too," Nathan said. "It has been 8 weeks, Nathaniel." 7, I counted. She set down her cup. She is not a foolish woman. She already suspects something is not as you've presented it. She hasn't said anything. Clara doesn't say things before she's certain of them, Margaret said. That is one of her finest qualities. It is also the reason that when she does say something, you will not enjoy it. Nathan looked at his coffee. He thought about the previous Thursday, the way Clara had paused mid-sentence when the estate manager had ridden past the cottage gate and touched his hat in the direction of the garden, with a particular degree of deference that was difficult to explain away. The way her hands had stilled on the trowel. The way she'd looked at Nathan with those steady gray eyes for just a half-second longer than usual, before going back to her work without comment. Margaret was right, she knew. She just hadn't said. "A little longer," he said. Margaret picked up her cup again. "You are making a mistake," she said, the way she said everything not cruelly, just with the precision of a woman who had lived long enough to recognize a mistake when she saw one, and had stopped softening the observation out of courtesy. Nathan said nothing, because she was right, and he knew it, and saying so wouldn't help anything. He went to the cottage garden that Thursday anyway. The trouble had started, as most troubles did, before he'd recognized it as trouble. He had come to the cottage 8 weeks ago, 6. He corrected himself, before acknowledging was probably right, and it was 8, because Margaret had written him one of her letters. She wrote him letters the way other grandmothers sent baskets of food, regularly, without excessive sentiment, and with a firmness that made them impossible to ignore. This one had said only that she had twisted her ankle and was managing perfectly well, and that if he came by while he was in Richmond, he should bring the book she'd ordered from the printer on 4th Street. He had come the following day. He had expected to find her in the cottage, resting, possibly annoyed about the ankle. He had not expected to find the garden being tended by a young woman in a blue dress, not the fine blue dress she'd apparently worn to the party, which he'd heard about from half a dozen people in the days following, but a practical work dress. Dark and worn and entirely appropriate for kneeling in dirt, which she was doing with an air of complete concentration and no self-consciousness whatsoever. Margaret had watched his face with that sharp-eyed awareness she'd had since he was 8 years old. "That is Miss Clara Whitmore," she'd said. "She helped me the night of the storm. She comes on Thursdays. You don't receive visitors," he'd said. "I receive her," Margaret had said with a finality that closed the topic. He had introduced himself as Nathan, not Nathaniel. Nathan. He had told himself that he simply didn't want the complication, the change in tone that always happened when people learned his full name and his full situation. The way they began to manage themselves in his presence, carefully select their words, to become the version of themselves they thought he wanted to see. He was in Richmond for 2 weeks. He would come to visit his grandmother. It would be simple. It was not simple. Clara Whitmore had looked at him with those gray eyes and told him he could hand her things and try not to pull up anything that wasn't a weed, and he had crouched in the dirt beside her and done exactly that. And it had been the most straightforwardly pleasant afternoon he had spent in memory. She didn't manage herself around him. She didn't select her words. She argued when she disagreed, which was often, and she was quiet when she was thinking, which he found he respected enormously, because most people talked through their thinking and expected you to wait for them to arrive at something worth hearing. Clara thought first and then spoke, and when she spoke, she meant it. The 2 weeks had become 8. He had business in Richmond, he told himself. The estate accounts. The meetings with the county commissioners about the road legislation that had been stalled in the for 3 sessions running. All legitimate, all real, none of it was why he stayed. That Thursday he arrived at the cottage garden to find Clara already there, and Margaret conspicuously absent. The chair in the garden sat empty. The cottage door was open, indicating Margaret was inside, but she did not come out. Nathan understood immediately that this was deliberate. Clara was working on the south bed, which she'd been systematically reclaiming over the past several weeks. She had her back to him when he came through the gate, and she didn't turn around, though he was fairly certain she'd heard him. "She's inside," Clara said. "She said her ankle is bothering her." "I suspect her ankle is fine." "Her ankle is fine," Nathan confirmed. A pause. Clara kept working. "Are you going to sit in the empty chair and supervise," she said, "or are you going to be useful?" He went and got the spare trowel from the shed. They worked in silence for a while, which was something he'd learned was not a problem between them. The silence with Clara was not empty, it had texture to it. He was aware of her in it, aware of the steadiness of her movements, the small occasional sounds she made when she found something satisfying or something frustrating. "I've been thinking," she said. "About the lavender beds?" he asked. They'd been disagreeing about the lavender beds for 3 weeks. "About you," she said. He kept his hands moving. "Nathan isn't your name," she said. Not an accusation, just a statement, in the same tone she used for everything clear and direct, with no theatrical winding up. He didn't answer immediately. He was thinking about what Margaret had said that morning. About the mistake he was making. About the 8 weeks. "It's part of my name," he said, the other part being Caldwell. The trowel in his hand kept moving, 1, 2, 3 seconds. "Yes," he said. Clara sat back on her heels. She didn't look at him, which somehow made it worse or better, he wasn't sure. She looked at the bed in front of her, at the cleared rows she'd been working toward for weeks. "How long have you known?" he asked. "A while." She pulled a weed. "Set it aside. Long enough. Clara, don't." Her voice was still level, which was almost harder to take than anger would have been. Anger he could have responded to. This even careful level was something different. "Don't tell me you meant to say something. Don't tell me it wasn't the right time." "I was going to tell you." "When?" He opened his mouth. Closed it. She turned and looked at him then, and her face was composed in the way faces are composed when composure is being held deliberately over something that is not composed at all underneath. "I came here for 8 weeks, she said. "I worked in this garden. I talked to your grandmother. I talked to you, a beat. I talked to you about things I don't talk to most people about. Because I thought." She stopped, started again. "I thought you were someone who was being honest with me." "Everything I said was honest," he said. "You let me believe you were an ordinary man." "I didn't say I was ordinary. You didn't say you were Nathaniel Caldwell." She stood. Brushed the dirt from her hands with a few short, precise gestures. "The man that every family in 3 counties has been trying to marry their daughters to. The man whose grandmother I helped in the rain, not knowing who she was." Her voice had something in it now, not anger, something more complicated. Something that hurt. "Do you understand what it looks like? Someone in my position helping her, and then spending 8 weeks in this garden with you?" "It looks like exactly what it is," he said. "It looks like I planned it," she said. "It looks like I knew who she was, like I calculated every Thursday. Like I was positioning myself, the way everyone else positions themselves around your family." She looked at him steadily. "People are not going to believe I didn't know." He stood. "I don't care what people believe." "I do," Clara said. "I have to live here, Mr. Caldwell. I have to do business here. My name is all I have that's mine." Her voice didn't waver, but her hands pressed together briefly at her sides, and he caught that small, controlled gesture that she made when something cost her. "And you made a decision about what truth I deserve to know, without asking me." The word landed with the accuracy of something she'd been holding for a while. He had no immediate answer for it, because she was right. That was exactly what he'd done. He had decided what she deserved to know, based on what he wanted the situation to be, not on what she was owed as a person who was being honest with him. "I'm sorry," he said. Clara looked at him. The composure was still there, but underneath it, he could see the cost of maintaining it. "I know," she said. "I believe you mean that." She picked up her basket. "I need to go, Clara." She stopped at the gate, didn't turn around. "I stayed," he said. 8 weeks. I had no reason to still be in Richmond. My business was done in the first 2. He paused. "I stayed because Thursday was the one day of the week I was not managing something, or performing something, or being careful about something. I stayed because you talk to me like a person and argue with me like you mean it." And he stopped. Started again. "I stayed because I didn't want it to end." Clara's hand was on the gate. He watched her fingers on the iron. "That's not nothing," he said quietly, a long silence. "No," she said finally, "it's not nothing." She pushed the gate open. "Good afternoon, Mr. Caldwell." She walked away down the road, and he stood at the gate and watched her go, and the garden behind him was very quiet. Inside the cottage, Margaret said nothing when he came through the door. She was sitting in her chair by the window, and she had very clearly heard every word, and she was very carefully, not looking like someone who had heard every word. He sat down across from her. "You were right," he said. "I usually am," she said. "It doesn't always help." She looked at him then. "What are you going to do?" He leaned forward and pressed his hands together between his knees. "I don't know." "Yes, you do." He was quiet, Nathaniel. Her voice shifted, not harsh, but stripped of the dry wit she kept it in most of the time, down to something simpler and more direct underneath. "That young woman has spent 8 weeks working in my garden for nothing except conversation and tea. And she has never once said a word that suggested she wanted anything from me, or from you, or from this family. Do you understand how rare that is? Yes. Do you understand that what she said is true, that people will talk, that her position is vulnerable in ways yours is not? Yes. Then you understand that what you owe her is not an apology," Margaret said. "You have already given her that. What you owe her is a decision. Either you take this seriously and you behave accordingly, or you let her walk down that road and you do not follow her, and you do not make things more difficult for her than they already are." He said nothing. Margaret asked. He sat for a while. The window light moved. He could hear, distantly, the sounds of the estate beyond the cottage wall, the ordinary sounds of a life that was his whether he wanted all of it or not, the life that came with his name and his history and his responsibilities. Then he stood up. "I'll need the carriage," he said. Margaret settled back in her chair with an expression that was as close to satisfied as she allowed herself in public. "I thought you might," she said. He caught up with her at the edge of the Caldwell Road, where it met the main road into Richmond, and she heard the carriage coming and turned. And her face went through several things in rapid succession before settling into something careful and waiting. He stepped down before it had fully stopped. "I have something to say," he said. "You don't have to listen, but I'd like you to." Clara stood with her basket. She did not say yes and she did not say no, which he took as permission enough. "My name is Nathaniel Caldwell," he said. "My father died when I was 22. I manage the estate and I have obligations to the county, and I sit in rooms with men who talk about legislation, and I attend things I am required to attend, and I do all of it because it is what is required of me." He paused. "I have been doing it for 12 years, and it is necessary. It is necessary work, but there is a great deal of it that I find," he chose the word carefully, "suffocating." Clara was still watching him with that waiting expression. "I came to Richmond 2 months ago with every intention of managing my grandmother's concern about her ankle and attending to my accounts, and leaving again within a fortnight," he said. "I came to that garden because she asked me to, and I introduced myself as Nathan because," he stopped. "Honest." He was going to be honest. "Because I wanted an afternoon that was not about the Caldwell name. I wanted to hand someone tools and hear someone argue with me about roses without knowing or caring whether I could do something for them." And it was. He met her eyes. "It was the best afternoon I'd had in years. And I could not make myself give it up." Clara said nothing. But she was listening. "What you said was right," he said. "I made a decision about what truth you deserve to know. I had no right to do that." He stopped again, let the silence sit. "I am not going to tell you I intended no harm. I intended convenience, and it caused harm, and that is mine to own." He looked at her directly. "What I can tell you is that every word I said to you in that garden was true. Not performed, not managed. True. The road was quiet around them. A bird somewhere in the fence line. The carriage horses shifting behind him." "You've made my position very difficult," Clara said. "I know. People are already talking," Caroline Ashford told Mrs. Patterson that she'd seen me at the cottage garden 3 Thursdays running, and Mrs. Patterson mentioned it to at least 4 people I know of. He had not known this. His jaw tightened briefly. "They're saying I positioned myself deliberately," Clara said. "That I knew who your grandmother was when I helped her. That I calculated the whole thing." She looked at him steadily. You cannot undo that by apologizing to me on a country road. No, he said, I can't. He held her gaze. But I can choose how I conduct myself going forward, and I can be clear publicly about the nature of what happened. I can make sure that anyone who speaks to me on the subject understands that you helped my grandmother before you knew who she was, and that you came to the garden at her invitation, and that you have behaved with more honesty than most people I know. That's very gallant, Clara said, and it wasn't warm exactly, but it wasn't cold either. I'm not trying to be gallant, he said. I'm trying to be accurate. He paused. There is a difference. She looked at him for a long time, that particular quality of looking she had, that made him feel assessed without feeling diminished. He let her look. I'm not going to stop coming to the garden, she said. Your grandmother needs someone to finish the iris beds before fall, and I started the job and I intend to finish it. I know, he said. I wouldn't ask you to stop, and I'm not. She paused, working out the words. I'm not willing to pretend that this situation is simpler than it is. You are Nathaniel Caldwell. I am a seamstress from Merchant Street. Anyone watching this is going to draw conclusions, and some of those conclusions are going to be unkind to me regardless of the truth. I know that too. Then you know why I need you to be careful, she said. Not for your sake. For mine. Something in him shifted, not painfully but significantly, the way a weight redistributes when it is finally acknowledged rather than carried silently. Yes, he said. She studied him for another moment. Then she looked down at her basket, and back up at him, and made a small decision that he could almost see her make. You may ride back to Richmond, she said. It is getting late, and the road is dusty, and I would rather not walk in the heat. It was not forgiveness. He understood that clearly. It was not the restoration of the easy Thursdays, but it was something, a door left open rather than shut, and he knew better than to ask for more than that. Thank you, he said. He handed her into the carriage with the care he'd have shown anyone, not more and not less, and he did not touch her hand for longer than necessary. And she sat with her basket in her lap and looked out the window and did not speak, and he respected that entirely. The talk in Richmond had started quietly, as Richmond talk always did, and then gotten louder. Clara heard it in pieces over the following week through Mrs. Patterson's carefully neutral tone when Clara came in to deliver the Thursday order, through the way two women at the fabric merchant's stopped their conversation when she walked in and resumed it in lower voices when she moved away, through Ruth Harding's face at breakfast on Monday, which was doing the complicated thing again. Tell me, Clara said. Ruth set down her fork. Vivian Ashford was at the Pattersons' dinner on Saturday. Clara waited. She told a story, Ruth said, about the night of the storm. She said she'd seen you on the road and that you had been walking in the direction of the Caldwell estate with clear purpose. She said. Ruth paused. She said it was well known that you had been inquiring about the Caldwell family before the party. That you'd asked questions about who would be attending. That's not true, Clara said. I know it's not true. I asked you whether the invitation was for all families in the county, or only certain ones, Clara said. Because I didn't want to arrive somewhere I hadn't been properly invited to. I know, Ruth said. Vivian Ashford heard me ask you that question, and she has. Clara stopped. Steadied herself. She has shaped it into something it wasn't. Yes, Ruth said quietly. Clara was silent for a moment. She was thinking about what Nathaniel had said on the road. About being clear publicly about what had actually happened. She was thinking about Vivian Ashford, who she did not know well but whom she knew by sight, the Ashford family, old money, old names, old certainties about who belonged where and why. She was thinking about her own name, the only thing that was hers. I am not going to defend myself to Vivian Ashford, Clara said. Or to anyone Vivian Ashford is speaking to, Clara. I am going to go to work, Clara said. I am going to complete my orders. I am going to go to the cottage on Thursday and finish the iris beds because I told Margaret I would and I keep my word. She looked at Ruth. If someone wants to tell a story about me, they will tell it whether I defend myself or not. What I can control is my behavior. That's all. Ruth looked at her with an expression that was not worried exactly, but aware of a kind of trouble that work and dignity alone could not entirely solve. "You're right," Ruth said. "You're absolutely right." She picked up her fork again. "I just worry, I know," Clara said. "I'd rather you didn't." "That's not how worry works. I know that too." Vivian Ashford came into the shop on Wednesday. Clara had been expecting this in the back of her mind, with the kind of low-grade certainty of someone waiting for weather they can smell coming. She was at the work table when the door opened, and she recognized Vivian before she fully looked up by the sound of her footsteps, measured and deliberate, and by the quality of the silence that she brought in with her. Vivian was 25 and beautiful in the way that has been carefully maintained and always knows it. She wore a pale green dress that was, Clara noted professionally, exquisitely made. She stood in the center of the shop with the ease of someone who was accustomed to all spaces accommodating themselves to her presence. "Miss Whitmore," she said. "Not warm, Miss Ashford," Clara said. "Can I help you?" "I need a consultation on fabric," Vivian said. She moved to the counter where the fabric samples were laid out and began examining them with every appearance of genuine interest, which Clara suspected was entirely false. "I'm having a new gown made for the harvest assembly." Of course. Clara came around the table to the counter. She was polite, precise, professional. "What did you have in mind?" They went through the motions for a few minutes. Vivian asking questions about colors and weights and prices. Clara answering them accurately and without embellishment. Both of them aware that this was not about fabric. Then Vivian said, still looking at a swatch of rose-colored silk, "I heard you've been spending time at the Caldwell cottage." "I've been helping Mrs. Holloway with her garden," Clara said. "That's very kind of you." A pause. The silk swatch turned over in her fingers. "She is a private woman. She doesn't usually accept that kind of assistance." "She was unwell," Clara said. "She needed someone." "And you were available." Vivian looked up from the fabric. Her eyes were light blue and very direct. "You have to understand how it appears, Miss Whitmore." "I understand exactly how it appears to some people," Clara said. "And I also know what the truth is. The truth isn't always what protects a reputation." "No," Clara agreed, "but it's what allows you to live with yourself." Something moved across Vivian's face, something she controlled quickly, but not quite quickly enough. It was not, Clara thought, entirely contempt. It was something more complex, almost recognition. As though she'd said something Vivian had not expected her to say, and Vivian was not entirely sure how to categorize it. "I am not your enemy, Miss Whitmore," Vivian said quietly. "I didn't say you were. I am warning you," she said. "There are people in this county who will make things very unpleasant for someone in your position who appears to be reaching above her station. I am trying to tell you before it goes further." Clara looked at her steadily. "And I'm telling you that I helped an old woman who was in pain in the rain, and she invited me to her garden, and I accepted. There is no reaching in that. There is no calculation in that." She held Vivian's gaze. "If people need a more complicated story, I can't provide it." A silence. The shop was very still. "You are very certain of yourself," Vivian said. "I am certain of what I did," Clara said. "That's enough." Vivian looked at the silk swatch still in her hand, then set it down with a small, careful motion. "I'll think about the rose silk," she said. "Good day, Miss Whitmore." "Good day, Miss Ashford." The door closed. Clara stood at the counter for a moment, her hands flat on the wood, and let herself feel the full weight of what had just happened, not the visible part, the composed professional exchange, but the part underneath it. The part that understood exactly how much danger her name was in, and how little she could do about it with words alone. She was not afraid. Fear wasn't useful, but she was under no illusions about what was coming. That Thursday, Nathan was at the cottage when she arrived. Margaret was outside for the first time in 2 weeks, ankle improved, installed in her chair in the garden with the firmness of a woman reclaiming her rightful position. She looked at Clara when she came through the gate and said, with no preamble, "Vivian Ashford came to your shop." Clara stopped. "How do you know that?" I know most things that happen in this county, Margaret said. Eventually, she looked at her garden. What did she say? Clara set down her basket. She warned me. She said the talk would get worse and that I should understand what I was reaching into. Margaret's jaw tightened. It was the first time Clara had seen something like anger in her, real anger, the kind that has a long history to it. Vivian Ashford, Margaret said, has spent the last 3 years pursuing my grandson with the determination of a woman who has been told since childhood that he is the correct ambition to have. She looked at Clara. She is not a foolish girl, but she has been badly taught. Nathan, who had said nothing so far, said, "She came to the shop." It was a business call, Clara said, mostly Clara. She looked at him. He was standing with the spare trowel in one hand, and his face was doing something she hadn't seen it do before, a kind of controlled anger, similar to Margaret's but aimed outward. She was not threatening me, Clara said. She was warning me. There's a difference. She picked up her own trowel. And she was right, which makes it harder. She had no right. She had every right, Clara said. People talk. She's telling me people are talking. That's not her fault. She crouched down at the iris bed. What's my fault is if I let it change what I do. Nathaniel looked at her for a moment longer. Then he crouched down beside her, the way he always did, and picked up the trowel and started working. They worked in silence for a while. Then he said, very quietly, not looking at her, "I am going to go to the Pattersons' next gathering." Clara's hand stilled. "And I am going to make it very clear to anyone who wishes to discuss the matter what actually happened on the night of the storm and what your presence in this garden means and has always meant." He looked up. His eyes were direct. "You told me to be careful for your sake." "I intend to be, but careful does not mean silent." Clara looked at him, the iris bed, back at him. "You don't need to fight my battles," she said. "I know." He held her gaze. "But there are things I have the standing to say that you do not, and it seems wasteful not to say them." The garden was warm around them. Margaret had gone very still in her chair, the way she went still when she was paying the most attention. Clara thought about her name, about the one thing that was hers. "All right," she said. He nodded, looked back down at the earth. And they worked, and the August heat settled around them. And somewhere in the quiet of that garden, something shifted, not dramatically, not with ceremony, but with the slow certainty of a season changing. The kind of change that is happening long before you can name it and goes on long after you have. Nathan kept his word. Clara heard about it secondhand, which was the only way she heard about most things that happened in the drawing rooms of Richmond society, filtered through Ruth's morning reports. Through the careful neutral tones of customers who weren't sure how much she knew. Through the way certain conversations paused when she entered a room and resumed at a slightly different angle when she left. What she heard was this: Nathaniel Caldwell had attended the Patterson gathering on Friday evening. He had arrived late, which was unusual for him, and he had been, by all accounts, in a mood that discouraged the particular kind of social performance that usually characterized those evenings. He had spoken to Robert Patterson directly about the road legislation, which was legitimate business. He had accepted a glass of something and stood near the fireplace, and when Vivian Ashford's mother had made a remark practiced. The kind of remark that carries its meaning underneath the words, rather than on top of them, about the surprising social mobility one observed in certain quarters of Richmond these days. Nathaniel Caldwell had looked at her with complete composure and said, "I imagine you're referring to Miss Whitmore. She assisted my grandmother during the storm in July, at considerable personal inconvenience and without any knowledge of who my grandmother was. She comes to the cottage garden at my grandmother's invitation. I find it speaks well of her character, and poorly of anyone who would characterize it otherwise." He had said it pleasantly, not with heat. That was what made it effective, that it was not a defense made in anger, but a correction made with the quiet certainty of a man who was accustomed to being listened to and was using that accustomedness deliberately. Clara heard this on Saturday morning from Ruth, who had heard it from Mrs. Delaney, who had been there. She sat with her coffee and she didn't say anything for a long moment. "He said that," she said finally, "word for word, according to Mrs. Delaney," Ruth said, who has excellent recall. Clara looked at her coffee cup. "Well," she said. "Well," Ruth agreed. The silence between them had a particular texture to it, the texture of something that had shifted and could not shift it back, and both of them knew it, and neither of them was entirely sure what to do with the knowledge. "He shouldn't have had to say it," Clara said. "No," Ruth said. "He shouldn't have. But he did. It's going to make things more complicated." "Clara," Ruth set down her cup, "things are already complicated. The only question is what kind of complicated." Clara looked at her. Ruth looked back, steady and patient, the way she always was when she was waiting for Clara to catch up to something Ruth had seen coming for a while. Clara picked up her cup and took a long sip and said nothing, because there was nothing to say yet that she was ready to say out loud. The complication arrived on Tuesday, wearing the face of a man Clara had never seen before. He came into the shop mid-morning, when Ruth was out making a delivery, and Clara was alone at the work table with a half-finished bodice in front of her. He was perhaps 50, thick through the shoulders, with the kind of face that had been handsome once, and had curdled slightly into something that expected deference. His clothes were expensive. His manner was the manner of a man who considered entering a small shop on Merchant Street a minor inconvenience he was tolerating. He introduced himself as Gerald Ashford, Vivian's father. Clara set down her needle. She did not stand Mr. Ashford. "How can I help you?" He looked around the shop with the particular look of a man cataloging his assessment of the place and finding it confirming his expectations. Then he looked at her. "I'll be brief," he said. "I believe in plain speaking." "As do I," Clara said. "My daughter has an understanding with Nathaniel Caldwell," he said. "Not a formal arrangement, not yet, but an understanding that has existed between our families for the better part of 3 years. I imagine you can appreciate what that means." Clara kept her face still. "I appreciate what you're telling me it means. You're a smart woman," he said. "I can see that. Smart women understand context." He moved to the counter, rested one hand on it in a way that was meant to claim the space. "The context here is that you have inserted yourself perhaps innocently. I'm willing to grant you that into a situation that was already arranged. And the sensible thing, for a woman in your position, would be to step back from it." "Step back from a garden," Clara said. "Step back from the Caldwell family," he said. "From any association that could be misconstrued." "It seems like the only people misconstruing it are the ones who want to," Clara said. His expression shifted, not angry yet, but approaching it. "Miss Whitmore, I am trying to be courteous. You help Mrs. Holloway. That's admirable. But there's a difference between helping an old woman and spending every Thursday in proximity to the most eligible man in the county." "Mrs. Holloway invited me to her garden," Clara said. "She is the one I have a relationship with. What Mr. Caldwell does on Thursdays is his own business. His business becomes my business," Ashford said, "when my daughter's future is attached to it." Clara looked at him steadily. "Has Mr. Caldwell made any arrangement with your family?" A pause. "Not formally. Has he made any indication that he intends to?" Shorter pause. "These things take time. Then with respect, Mr. Ashford," Clara said, "the understanding you're describing appears to be primarily your own." The silence that followed was the kind that has real danger in it. Not the danger of a raised voice, but the quieter danger of a man deciding what kind of pressure to apply next. "You have a business here," he said. "A good one from what I understand. My family has considerable acquaintance in Richmond. The kind of acquaintance that can make or unmake a shop's clientele in a matter of weeks." He let that settle. "I would hate to see your hard work suffer for a misunderstanding." Clara's hands, resting on the work table, were very still. "Are you threatening my livelihood, Mr. Ashford?" "I'm describing reality," he said. "What you do with the description is your own choice." She looked at him for a long moment. She was thinking about her father's tools, still hung on the wall of the back room in the same order he kept them. She was thinking about the years she had spent building this shop back up after he died, the customers she had earned one at a time with careful work, and kept with honest dealing. She was thinking about Vivienne coming into this shop last week with her warning, and how that warning had been offered with something almost like decency in it, and how this felt nothing like that. "Good morning, Mr. Ashford," she said. "I need to get back to my work." His jaw tightened. He straightened. He looked at her once more with the look of a man who had not expected to be dismissed and was filing the experience away for later use. Then he left. Clara sat still for 2 full minutes after the door closed. Her hands had developed a faint tremor that she stilled by pressing them flat against the table. Then she picked up her needle, and she went back to work because work was what she had, and it was what she'd always had, and it was not nothing. She did not tell Nathan on Thursday. She almost did twice, in fact, when the conversation moved close enough to the territory that the words were almost there. But she pulled back each time, because she was not willing to be the kind of woman who ran to a powerful man with her troubles. And because she was not yet sure what telling him would accomplish, except making him angry on her behalf, which would complicate things further. She worked in the garden. They argued about whether to move the lavender beds, which they had been arguing about for 6 weeks now with increasing good humor and decreasing actual conviction, since both of them had come to suspect that arguing about the lavender beds had become something they did for its own sake, the argument being more interesting than any possible resolution. "If you move them," Clara said, "you lose the southern exposure they've had for 10 years. You don't just move lavender. It has opinions about where it lives." "Everything in this garden has opinions," Nathan said. "That is not, in my experience, a reason not to make necessary changes. Is moving lavender that was growing perfectly well before you arrived a necessary change? The bed is overcrowded. The bed is established." She sat back and looked at it critically. "I can thin it in place. You don't have to move it. If you thin it, you lose half the plants. If you move it, you risk losing all of them. Lavender roots don't always survive transplanting." He considered this. She could see him actually considering it, which was one of the things about him. She had stopped, trying not to notice the way he genuinely thought about what she said instead of waiting for her to finish so he could say what he'd already decided. He was a man who updated his positions when given good reason to, which was rarer than it should have been. "Thin it," he said, "but I want to move the 2 on the end. Those are overcrowded past what thinning can fix." "The 2 on the end I'll allow," she said. "That might be the most territory you've ever conceded on a garden issue." "Don't get used to it," he smiled. The real one, not the managed version she'd seen when he was being Nathaniel Caldwell and company. She had learned the difference months ago. Margaret from her chair said, "While the 2 of you have been negotiating the lavender for the past 6 weeks, the roses on the north wall have gotten entirely out of hand." "We've been getting to the roses," Clara said. "You have been getting to the lavender." "The lavender needed attention. The lavender," Margaret said crisply, "will be the death of this garden and possibly of this family." Nathan caught Clara's eye. Clara looked away quickly, because the laugh that was trying to happen was inappropriate and she was not going to let it. She let it anyway. Nathan did too. Margaret watched them with an expression of absolute dignity that was only slightly undermined by the fact that her mouth was also doing something against her will. It was after the garden, when Nathan had walked Clara to the cottage gate, as he sometimes did, not escorting her, nothing as formal as that, just walking the same direction, that he said, without any particular preamble, something happened. Clara stopped. "What?" "Margaret's physician came Tuesday," he said. "Her heart has been," he paused, choosing words. "She has not been as well as she has been telling us. Either of us." "How serious?" she asked. "The physician is cautious. He says she needs rest. Real rest, not the kind she's been pretending to take." His voice was controlled, but underneath it she could hear the thing he was controlling. "She is not in immediate danger. But she is 72 and she has been doing too much and pretending otherwise, and he stopped." "You're frightened," Clara said. He looked at her. Not offended by the directness, just struck by it, the way he sometimes was when she said something exact. "Yes," he said. She thought about the morning she had arrived at the cottage to find Margaret's chair empty and the cottage door open, and the particular quality of stillness that had made her chest tighten before she even knew why. She thought about Margaret's voice the first night, worn but not afraid, the voice of a woman who had been managing her own reality for a long time. "She should have told us," Clara said. "She should have told someone," he said. "She didn't because she doesn't want to be," he exhaled. "She doesn't want to be worried over. She considers it an indignity." "I know," Clara said. They were both quiet for a moment. The gate was cold iron under Clara's hand. "I'm going to stay through the fall," he said. "I had planned to return to the main estate by October, but I'm not going to leave while she's not well." Clara nodded. "She'll fight you on it. She will fight me on everything." A pause. "She always has. I used to find it exhausting. He didn't finish. "Now you'd rather have her arguing with you than the alternative," Clara said. "Yes." He looked at the gate. "Exactly that. She understood this. She understood it in a way that had its own history, its own particular texture of memory, the years of her father's declining health. The slow understanding that the person you argued with every day was the person whose absence would be the loudest thing in the room. She understood it with her whole body, the way certain knowledge lives below the mind. "I'll keep coming on Thursdays," she said. "She won't stop me, and I won't let her pretend she's well when she isn't." He looked at her. "Clara, she needs someone who isn't family," she said. "Someone she can't manage. She can manage you because she knows how much you love her. She can't manage me because," she paused, "I'm not sure she knows yet what I am to her. And that uncertainty keeps her honest." He was silent for a moment. "That is," he said slowly, "the most perceptive thing I have ever heard anyone say about my grandmother. I've had time to study her. She'd hate knowing she was studied." "She'd also know I was right," Clara said, "which she'd hate more." He laughed, short, surprised, genuine, the kind of laugh that comes out before the person decides to let it. Then he said quietly, "Thank you for the Thursdays." For all of it. Clara looked at the gate, at the garden beyond it, which she had been tending since August, and which had, she realized, become as familiar to her as her own workroom. Margaret's garden, the iris beds she'd saved from neglect. The lavender they'd argued about for 6 weeks. The roses on the north wall that they kept meaning to get to. "Don't thank me," she said. "I wanted to be here." It was the most she'd said directly. She felt it hanging in the air between them, after she said it, exposed in a way that made her want to qualify it, soften it, add something that would make it smaller. She didn't. He didn't say anything either, but he held the gate open for her, and she walked through it, and when she glanced back once, he was still standing there watching her go, and his expression was the one she hadn't yet found a name for. The second blow landed on a Wednesday, and it came from a direction she hadn't expected. Mrs. Patterson came into the shop herself, not to order fabric. Clara knew immediately because Mrs. Patterson's had been a customer for 6 years, and she always came in with a specific purpose and communicated it within the first 30 seconds. Today she stood at the counter with her hands folded, and her face arranged into the particular expression of a woman delivering information she has decided it is her responsibility to deliver. "I want you to know," she said, without much preamble, "that I told Gerald Ashford in my own home that his behavior was unacceptable." Clara went still. "You know about the visit. He told Robert about it himself, Mrs. Patterson said. "Apparently he considered it successful." Her mouth was thin. "He was wrong about that." Mrs. Patterson let me finish. She unfolded and refolded her hands. "I have known Margaret Holloway for 30 years. I knew her when her husband was alive, and I knew her when her daughter died, and I know the kind of woman she is. She does not open that gate for anyone. In 30 years, she has not opened that gate for anyone." She looked at Clara directly. "The fact that she opened it for you means something. I want you to know that I know that." Clara's throat was doing something she needed it to stop doing. "Thank you," she said. "I also want to warn you, Mrs. Patterson said, and her voice shifted into something quieter. "Gerald Ashford is not a man who gives up an objective easily. He has money and he has connections and he has a daughter he has decided on a future for. He will not stop at one visit. She paused. And there is something else. Clara waited. He has spoken to your landlord, Mrs. Patterson said. About the shop lease. The quiet that followed had weight in it. The lease, Clara said carefully, is held by the Merchant Street Property Group. Has been for 6 years. Gerald Ashford sits on the board of the property group, Mrs. Patterson said. He has since January. Clara heard this the way you hear news that your body understands before your mind does, with a specific physical response. A cooling along the back of her neck, a steadying of her breathing that was the opposite of calm. When does my lease come up? She asked. I believe, Mrs. Patterson said carefully, in 4 months. 4 months. I see, Clara said. I don't know if he will actually do anything, Mrs. Patterson said. He may simply be making the threat. But I thought you should know the ground you're standing on. Yes, Clara said, thank you. I appreciate that. Mrs. Patterson left, and Clara stood at her counter for a long time, the shop very quiet around her, the tools of her father's trade on the wall of the back room, the work on the table half finished. The lease that was the foundation of everything she'd built sitting 4 months in the future with Gerald Ashford standing between her and it. She was not going to panic. Panic was useless, and she didn't indulge in useless things. But she was beginning to understand that what had been complicated was becoming dangerous, and that the space between those two things was smaller than she'd thought. She told Nathan on Thursday she hadn't planned to. She had planned, on the walk to the cottage, to keep working and to keep thinking and to solve this herself the way she had solved every problem in her life quietly, practically, without needing anything from anyone. She had almost convinced herself that this was still possible. Then she came through the gate, and Margaret was not in her chair in the garden, and Nathan was standing by the roses with his back to her, and his hands on the wall, the way a man stands when he is trying to hold himself together by putting his weight against something solid, and she stopped. Nathan. He turned. His face told her immediately that something had happened. Margaret, she said. She's inside, she's all right. He said both of those things quickly, in the specific tone of someone whose first instinct is to spare the other person. She had a bad night. The physician came this morning. She's resting. He paused. She asked for you. Clara was through the cottage door before he finished the sentence. Margaret was in her bed, which was the first time Clara had ever seen her horizontal in the daytime. And it was wrong in a specific way that made Clara's chest clench, because Margaret Holloway horizontal in the middle of a Thursday was a Margaret who was genuinely unwell. But her eyes when she opened them were sharp and present and deeply annoyed at the situation. You don't have to look at me like that, she said. Like what? Clara said. Like I'm about to do something dramatic. She shifted against the pillows with the careful movements of someone managing pain. I am not about to do anything dramatic. I am going to rest as the physician has asked, and I am going to be perfectly well by next Thursday. Good, Clara said. The roses on the north wall aren't going to manage themselves. Margaret made the sound that was her laugh, the roses. She shook her head. Come and sit down. You're making me tired standing there. Clara pulled the chair to the bedside and sat. Margaret looked at her with those sharp dark eyes, really looked the way she always did, the way that made Clara feel she was being read accurately. Tell me what's wrong, Margaret said. Clara blinked. You're the one who had a bad night, and you're the one who came through that door with your jaw set in the way it sets when you are managing something you haven't decided to share yet. Margaret folded her hands on the coverlet. I have been watching your jaw for 4 months. I know its meanings. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she told her. All of it Gerald Ashford in the shop, the threat about the clientele, Mrs. Patterson's visit yesterday, the lease. She told it the way she'd told Margaret everything, plainly and completely, without dramatizing and without minimizing. Margaret listened without interrupting, which was unusual. Her face went through several things, none of them the diplomatic composure she usually maintained. By the time Clara finished, what was on Margaret's face was simple and undisguised. It was fury. Gerald Ashford, she said, in a tone that was very quiet and very precise. came to your place of business, and threatened your livelihood. He described it as describing reality, Clara said. I know exactly how Gerald Ashford describes things, Margaret said. I have known that man for 25 years. He has been trying to attach his family to mine for 15 of them, and I have managed to prevent it, and now she stopped. Her hands pressed together on the coverlet. He will not do this. Margaret, he will not do this, she said again, and this time it wasn't anger. It was something older and more certain than anger. It was the voice of a woman who had lived 72 years and knew exactly how much authority she still carried when she chose to use it. You have done nothing wrong. You have done nothing except show more kindness and more integrity than anyone in this county has shown you in return, and I will not have Gerald Ashford dismantle your life over it. It's not your fight, Clara said. It became my fight, Margaret said, the moment he walked into your shop. They looked at each other. Clara felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, or perhaps had never felt precisely in this way, the feeling of someone standing in front of her with the full intention of standing there, not out of pity, not out of obligation, but out of something that was genuine and chosen and not asking for anything back. Her eyes were doing something she did not want them to do. Don't you dare, Margaret said, but gently. I'm not, Clara said. You were about to, I was not. Margaret looked at her for one more moment. Then she said, send Nathaniel in. He's in the garden. I know where he is. Send him in. Clara went to the door and said Nathan's name, and he came in from the garden, with dirt on his hands and his face doing the careful thing it did when he was watching his grandmother, and she stepped aside to let him through. She did not follow him in. She went back to the garden, and she stood at the north wall with her hands against the stone, and she breathed, because breathing was what you did when the ground was shifting, and you needed something solid. She heard their voices through the cottage window, not the words, just the rhythm of them. Nathan's voice even, then rising. Margaret's voice measured, then firm. Then silence, then Nathan's voice again, and this time the rhythm of it was different, not the voice of a man being told something, but the voice of a man deciding something. Clara stood at the wall for a long time. Then the cottage door opened and Nathan came out, and he walked across the garden to where she was standing, and his face was resolved. Whatever had been uncertain in him, whatever had been careful and measured and managing, was gone. What was in its place was something cleaner and more direct. He stood beside her at the wall. I'm going to speak to Gerald Ashford, he said. Nathan, he will not threaten your lease, he said. I will make sure of that. And what are you going to do? She asked. Tell him to leave me alone. He'll take it as confirmation that there's something between us worth protecting. He'll use it, let him. His jaw was set. I'm not going to manage this quietly anymore. I'm not going to be careful and measured while that man stands in your shop and threatens you. I'm done with careful. Clara looked at him. What does that mean? He turned to face her fully. In 8 months of Thursdays, of lavender arguments and shared silences and moments that had been building toward something she hadn't yet let herself name, he had never looked at her quite like this, without the management, without the carefulness, without the layer of Nathaniel Caldwell between himself and what he actually meant. It means, he said, that I would like to stop pretending that I come to this garden on Thursdays for the lavender. Clara's hands were still on the wall. That is not simple, she said. No, he agreed. It is not simple, he held her gaze. But I am asking you whether the complication is something you'd be willing to face. The garden was quiet around them. Margaret's cottage. The iris beds, the lavender they'd argued about for 6 weeks. The roses on the north wall that they'd never quite gotten to, which were right here under her hands, rough and real and thorned and alive. The Ashford lease threat is real, Clara said. My position in this town is real. The difference between your world and mine is real. Yes, he said, all of that is real. You understand what you'd be asking me to navigate. I understand it better than I did 2 months ago, he said. Because you've told me. Exactly and honestly, the way you tell me everything. She looked at the wall, at her own hands against it. I need you to understand, she said, very quietly, that I didn't come here for you. I came for your grandmother, and I came for this garden, and I came because I wanted to. I know, he said, and if whatever this is, if it goes wrong. She looked at him. I know, he said again. Quiet, certain, I know all of it, I'm asking anyway. The world was very still, and Clara Whitmore, who had been managing alone since she was 19 years old, who had never once asked anyone to fight her battles, or carry her weight, or stand between her and the difficulty of her life. Clara Whitmore looked at this man in his grandmother's garden and felt the terrifying, specific gravity of something she had been pretending not to feel for 8 months. She did not say yes, she did not say anything at all. But she did not step back from the wall, and he stayed where he was, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, and neither of them moved, and the October light came through the trees in long slanted lines. And somewhere above them on the north wall, the roses were growing in every direction, without asking anyone's permission. She didn't sleep well that night. That was the honest truth of it, and Clara was always honest with herself, even when she wasn't ready to be honest with anyone else. She lay in the dark above the shop on Merchant Street, and she stared at the ceiling, and she went over it the way she went over everything, methodically, practically, from every angle she could find. He had asked her a question. She had not answered it. That was where she was. The question itself didn't frighten her. What frightened her was that she knew the answer and had known it for longer than she was comfortable admitting, and knowing the answer meant stepping off ground. She understood onto ground she didn't. And Clara Whitmore had spent her entire adult life making sure she only stood on ground she understood. She got up before dawn and made coffee, and sat at the work table in the dark, and thought about Gerald Ashford. That was the practical problem, the lease, 4 months. She laid it out in her mind the way she laid out a pattern, measuring, assessing, looking for where the pieces fit and where they didn't. She had savings. Not enough to buy a property, but enough to sustain the business through a disruption if she had to move. There were other streets, other properties. Richmond was not one building on Merchant Street. But she had built this here, this specific place, her father's tools on the wall. She pressed her hands flat on the table and breathed. By the time Ruth came downstairs at 6, Clara had made a second pot of coffee and had the day's work laid out and her face arranged into something that didn't show the night she'd had. Ruth looked at her once and said nothing. Swit meant Ruth saw through the arrangement completely and was choosing to respect it for the moment. That was one of the things about Ruth, she knew when to wait. She waited until she'd had half a cup of coffee, and then she said, "Did something happen Thursday?" "Several things," Clara said. Ruth waited. Margaret Holloway had a bad night. Her heart. The physician is cautious but not alarmed. Clara kept her voice even. Gerald Ashford has been in contact with the Merchant Street Property Board. He sits on it. My lease is up in 4 months. Ruth's cup stopped moving. And Clara said, because Ruth deserved all of it, Nathaniel Caldwell said something to me in the garden that I haven't answered yet. A silence. What kind of something? Ruth said. The kind, Clara said carefully, that changes the shape of everything. Ruth looked at her for a long moment. Then she set her cup down and folded her hands on the table and said, with the particular gentleness she reserved for the things that mattered most, Clara. What do you want? Clara looked at her coffee. That, she said, is the question I've been avoiding. I know, Ruth said. I'm asking it anyway. Clara was quiet for a while. The shop was quiet around them, the early morning before the day started, before customers and orders, and the manageable, practical world took over. Just Ruth, and the question, and the honest answer, sitting right there at the edge of Clara's mouth. I want to finish the iris beds, she said finally. Ruth blinked. And the roses, Clara said. Nobody has properly dealt with those roses all season, and they're going to be a disaster by spring if someone doesn't. Ruth stared at her. And I want my lease, Clara said. And my father's tools on that wall, and I want. She stopped. Let the next part come the way it wanted to. I want to stop pretending I don't look forward to Thursdays more than any other day of the week. And I want to stop pretending that the reason is the garden. Ruth's expression went through several things in rapid succession. What settled on her face at the end was something warm and slightly watery that she controlled by taking a long sip of coffee. "Well," she said. "Well," Clara said, "that's a lot of wanting." "Yes," Clara said, "it is." Ruth set her cup down again and looked at her steady and clear. "Then you'd better figure out what you're going to do about Gerald Ashford before any of the rest of it is possible. Because that man will burn the ground before he lets you stand on it." Clara nodded. She had already known this, but hearing it said out loud made it solid in a way she needed. "I know," she said. "I'm working on it." What she was working on was this: she needed to understand Gerald Ashford better than he understood her. She started asking questions. Not loudly, not in ways that would get back to him, but carefully through the ordinary channels of a woman who had lived in Richmond long enough to know where information and how to find it without making noise. She talked to Mr. Gibbons at the fabric merchants, who had been doing business in Richmond for 40 years and knew the history of every family of consequence. She talked to old Henry Walsh at the courthouse steps, who had been a clerk for 3 county commissioners in succession and had the memory of a man who had spent decades writing things down. She talked, carefully, to Mrs. Delaney, who was the most reliably accurate source of social information in 3 counties and who had a long-standing low opinion of Gerald Ashford that predated Clara's situation by at least a decade. What she learned over the course of a week was instructive. Gerald Ashford had been trying to consolidate his family's social position for 20 years. He had married Vivienne's mother for her family name, which was old and respected. And he had spent the subsequent decades building on that foundation with money and strategic friendships, and the careful cultivation of men who sat on boards and committees. He was not a man of inherited consequence. He had made his consequence, piece by piece. And he was protective of it the way self-made men are protective of things that could be unmade. The Caldwell connection was the final piece, had been for 15 years. The alliance between his daughter and Nathaniel Caldwell would complete the picture he'd been building, would then transform Gerald Ashford from a man of significant wealth and careful influence into the father-in-law of Virginia's most respected landowner. It was not purely mercenary. He genuinely believed his daughter deserved it. He genuinely believed his family had earned it. But it was also, Clara understood, a house of cards. And the thing about a house of cards was that it fell inward. She sat with this knowledge for 2 days, turned it over, looked at it from every angle. Then she went to see Vivienne Ashford. She sent a note first, which was the correct thing to do. The note was brief and professional, and said only that she had a matter of some importance she wished discussed privately, and she would be grateful for 15 minutes of Miss Ashford's time at her earliest convenience. She sent it to the Ashford house on a Friday morning and had her reply by Friday afternoon, which told her something that Vivienne Ashford was curious enough not to delay. The meeting was Saturday. The Ashford parlor was everything the Whitmore shop was not: high ceilings, expensive furnishings, the particular kind of room that exists to communicate wealth without appearing to try. Clara sat in it with her back straight and her hands in her lap and noted all of it without being impressed by it, which was a skill she had developed young. Vivienne came in alone, which was deliberate: no chaperone, no audience. She sat across from Clara and looked at her with those light blue eyes that were considerably sharper than they'd appeared during the shop visit. "Miss Whitmore," she said, "I confess I was surprised by your note." "I imagined so," Clara said. "Thank you for seeing me." "I was curious." Vivienne folded her hands in a gesture that was so similar to her father's counterclaiming posture that Clara almost noted it aloud. "What is it you wanted to discuss?" "Your father came to my shop last week," Clara said. Something moved in Vivienne's face. "I know. Did you ask him to?" A pause, longer than it should have been. "No," Vivienne said. "Did you know he was going to?" Another pause. "I suspected he might do something." "I didn't know the specifics." She looked at Clara directly. "I want you to know that the visit was not. It was not something I would have asked for." "And the lease?" Clara said. Vivienne's composure slipped. Just slightly, a tightening around the eyes that she recovered quickly. What about the lease? Your father sits on the Merchant Street property board, Clara said. My lease comes up in 4 months. He mentioned during his visit that he understood my business was important to me. She held Vivienne's gaze. I want to understand whether the threat to that lease is real, or whether it was a performance intended to frighten me. The silence was different now. Vivienne was looking at her, with something that was not the social calculation of their earlier encounter, something more uncomfortable and more genuine. I didn't know about the lease, she said quietly. I believe you, Clara said, but your father did it in your name. He did all of it in your name. And I think you should know what is being done in your name, Miss Ashford. Vivienne looked away, first time she'd looked away since Clara arrived. My father, she said carefully, wants very much for me to have a particular future. I understand that. He has wanted it for a long time, and he has done things to try to secure it that I have not always, she stopped. Started again. I do not have as much influence over my father's actions as you might think. I don't think you have any, Clara said. That's why I came to you. She leaned forward slightly. Miss Ashford, I am going to say something honest to you, and I am going to ask you to hear it honestly. Vivienne met her eyes again, waiting. Mr. Caldwell is not going to marry you, Clara said. Not cruelly, plainly, not because of anything I have or haven't done. But because he is not what he feels toward you is not what a man feels toward the person he intends to marry. I think you know this. I think you have known it for a while. The silence was very long. What I don't think, Clara continued, is that you are a woman who actually wants a marriage built on a campaign your father conducted on your behalf, using threats against other people's livelihoods. I think you are smarter than that, and I think you are better than that. Vivienne's hands, folded in her lap, pressed together. You don't know me, she said. No, Clara agreed. But I know that when you came to my shop, you warned me. You didn't have to do that. You came and you told me what was coming, and you gave me a chance to make a different choice. That is not the action of someone who is comfortable with what is being done in her name. The room was very still. What do you want from me? Vivienne asked. Her voice was quieter now. The social architecture of the conversation had come down, and there were 2 women sitting in a room being honest with each other, which was rarer than it should have been. I want you to talk to your father, Clara said, not about me. About the lease, about what he has done and what it means, and whether the future he is trying to build for you is actually the future you want. And if he won't listen, I think he will listen to you more than he'll listen to anyone else, Clara said. Because he is doing all of this for you. That gives you leverage he doesn't know you have. Vivienne looked at her for a long time, long enough that Clara began to wonder whether she'd misjudged, whether the woman sitting across from her was less than Clara had assessed and more her father's daughter than her own person. Then Vivienne said, You are not what I expected. No one ever is, Clara said, a pause, and then very slightly Vivienne Ashford's mouth moved. No, she said, I suppose not. Clara did not know what happened between Vivienne and her father. She was not in that room and she was not told, and she did not ask. What she knew was that on Tuesday morning, 3 days after her visit to the Ashford house, she received a formal letter from the Merchant Street Property Board confirming that her lease had been renewed for another 3 years at the existing terms. No explanation, no mention of Gerald Ashford. Just the confirmation, delivered by a very correct young man who was not the same very correct young man who had delivered Margaret's first letter, but who carried himself with the same air of someone completing a task that had been decided by people with more authority than himself. Clara read it twice, folded it, put it in the drawer with her father's original shop deed. Then she sat down at the work table and pressed her hands flat on the surface and let herself feel, for approximately 2 minutes, everything she'd been holding together for the past 3 weeks. The relief and the exhaustion and the specific, solid satisfaction of having handled something hard without losing herself in the handling of it. 2 minutes. Then she picked up her needle. Ruth found her working when she came in and read the situation from the particular quality of Clara's posture, the way her shoulders had come down from where they'd been for weeks. Good news, Ruth said. The lease is renewed, Clara said. 3 years. Ruth sat down heavily in her chair. She put both hands over her mouth. Then she took them away and said with considerable feeling, "Thank God." "Yes," Clara said. "How? I had a conversation with who?" "Vivian Ashford." Ruth stared at her. "You went to Vivian Ashford?" "I did, and she spoke to her father." Clara kept working. "I don't know exactly what was said, but the letter came." Ruth was quiet for a moment, processing this with the thoroughness she applied to information that surprised her. Then she said, "You are the most unexpected person I have ever known, Clara Whitmore." "I know," Clara said. "You've told me. I intend to keep telling you." She went to the cottage on Thursday. Margaret was up. Not in the garden yet. The physician had been firm about the garden, needing to wait until her strength was more reliably back, but up and dressed, and in her chair inside with the look of a woman who had been resting long enough and was beginning to consider the medical profession an inconvenience. "The lease," she said, when Clara came through the door. It was the first thing she said, before good morning, before anything. Clara stopped. "How do you know about the lease?" "I know most things," Margaret said. Eventually, Clara sat. "Nathaniel told me about Gerald's visit to your shop," Margaret said. "I made some inquiries of my own." Margaret let me finish. She held up one hand. "I have been in this county for 50 years. I know people. I know people who know people. And I want you to know that I had already made 2 telephone calls before you apparently walked into the Ashford house and solved the problem yourself." Clara looked at her. "You made calls." "I was going to have Gerald Ashford removed from that property board," Margaret said, with the calm of a woman who had done more consequential things and was not particularly concerned about proportionality. "He has been on it for 8 months, and he has used its weight for personal objectives twice before you." "I had documentation." She paused. "You beat me to it." "I didn't remove him from anything," Clara said. "I talked to his daughter." "Which was considerably more elegant," Margaret admitted. "And more lasting." She looked at Clara steadily. "You understood that Vivienne was the leverage he didn't know existed." "She's a person," Clara said, "not a leverage point. She deserved to know what was being done in her name." Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said yes. She did. Something in her expression shifted, something that was not quite softness, because Margaret did not do softness in public, but something in its family. "You are a remarkable woman, Clara Whitmore. You've told me that before," Clara said. "I intend to keep telling you." A pause. "Nathaniel is in the garden." Clara looked toward the window. "He doesn't know about the lease yet," Margaret said. "I thought you should be the one to tell him." Clara stood, straightened her dress, looked at Margaret. "You've been managing this entire situation from that chair, haven't you?" she said. "I have been bedridden," Margaret said, with great dignity. "I have simply also been thinking." Clara shook her head. She went to the door, stopped with her hand on the frame. "Margaret," she said, "thank you for the gate." The first Thursday. Margaret looked at her. In 50 years in this county, in 30 years in this cottage, in a life that had given her grief and consequence, and a garden and 1 grandson who had finally come home to himself, Margaret Holloway looked at Clara Whitmore and let herself feel, briefly and completely, how right this was. "The gate was always open," she said. "You just walked through it." He was at the north wall, the roses. He heard her come through the gate and turned, and she watched his face read her, the way her shoulders were down, the way she was walking, something in the quality of her that was different from the last time he'd seen her. The tension of the past weeks resolved into something cleaner. "The lease is renewed," she said. He went still. "How?" "I talked to Vivienne." The stillness became something more charged. "You went to the Ashford house?" "Yes, Clara." "She's not her father," Clara said. "I thought she deserved to know what he'd done in her name." "I was right about that." She came to stand beside him at the wall. She handled the rest herself. He looked at her for a long time, that quality of attention she'd known for months now, the look that made her feel genuinely seen. "I had intended," he said carefully, "to speak to Gerald Ashford directly." "I know," she said. "That's why I went first. Because you didn't want me to fight your battle." Because, she said, you're fighting, it would have made it about you. Going myself made it about the truth. Those are different outcomes. He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with an expression that was on the edge of something she couldn't quite read: admiration, and not quite frustration, and not quite something warmer than both. You are, he said, the most relentlessly capable person I have ever met. Is that a complaint? No, he said, it is an observation. And an admission. He turned to face her fully, an admission that you have solved in the span of 1 week, a problem that I have been trying to figure out how to address for 3. A pause. Without any help from me. I didn't need help, she said. That's different from not wanting it. He caught that. She saw him catch it. Different how? He asked. She looked at the roses at the north wall. She'd been meaning to deal with all season. The roses that had been growing in every direction without asking permission, exactly as she'd thought 2 Thursdays ago. I have managed alone for a long time, she said. I am good at it. I prefer it most of the time, because when you manage alone you know exactly what you can rely on. She touched the wall, the roughness of old stone under her fingers. But there is a difference between choosing to manage alone, because it's what you've always done, and choosing it because it's what you actually want. The garden was very still. And which is it? He asked. Quietly, the same question she'd been circling for 2 weeks. She turned and looked at him. Brown eyes, steady. The man in the garden who argued about lavender and handed her tools and had stayed 8 weeks in Richmond past his business for the sake of one good Thursday. The man who had stood at the Patterson gathering and spoken her name in front of people who would have preferred he didn't. The man who had stood at this wall 2 Thursdays ago and taken the management off his face and just asked her the question. I answered your question, she said, in the garden. 2 Thursdays ago. He frowned slightly. You didn't say anything. No, she said. I didn't step back from the wall. She held his gaze. That was the answer. He was still for a moment. Then something happened on his face, the thing she'd been watching approach for months, the thing that had been building under all the careful, measured Nathaniel Caldwell management. The real version, the unperformed version. It moved across his features like weather, like the Virginia storm that had started all of this, coming in fast and without pretense. Clara, he said. I know, she said, it's complicated. I know. I don't care about the complicated. I do, she said. I care about it, practically. Your world and mine are not the same, and I will not pretend otherwise, because it would be a lie, and I do not lie to people. She stopped. To people you what? He said. She met his eyes. To people I love, she said. The word sat between them, clean and irreversible, the way the truest things always are. He didn't say anything immediately, which was correct, which was exactly what she would have expected from him. He thought before he spoke, and right now he was thinking. She could see it. She waited. I want to do this properly, he said. Not because of what people will say, because you deserve properly. He looked at her steadily. I want to speak to you openly. I want to court you, if you're willing, in whatever way makes sense to you. I want to figure out the complicated alongside you, not ahead of you or around you. He paused. And I want to get to the roses, today, because they have been waiting all season, and I am done letting things that matter wait. Clara looked at him, at the roses, at the garden that had been neglected and reclaimed, and argued over and slowly, painstakingly, made into something that was growing again. All right, she said. Get the pruning shears. He got the pruning shears. And they worked on the roses together, in the October light, with Margaret's voice coming occasionally through the cottage window commenting on their technique with the calm authority of a woman who had grown these roses for 30 years and was not going to stop having opinions about them simply because she was confined to a chair. Clara cut, Nathan steadied. They argued mildly about which branches needed to go and which needed to stay, and Clara was right about most of it and conceded when she wasn't. And Nathan was wrong about the 2 on the lower left and acknowledged it without requiring any ceremony around the acknowledgement. It was, Clara thought, exactly like every other Thursday. Exactly like the first one. In a way, the same work, the same ground, the same quality of being genuinely present with someone, in a way that was neither performance nor management. Except that now she knew, and he knew, and the air between them had the particular quality of things that have been said out loud and cannot be unsaid, which is not always a comfortable quality, but is always an honest one. Ruth had asked her what she wanted. She wanted this. The garden, and the work and the arguing, and the man who handed her tools, and thought before he spoke, and stayed past his business for the sake of one good Thursday, and looked at her like she was the most interesting thing in the room without requiring her to be anything other than exactly herself. She wanted the complicated. She was not afraid of complicated. She was afraid of easy things that turned out to be hollow, and this was not hollow. This was as solid as the stone wall she'd been standing at for weeks, rough and real and thorned and alive. By the time they finished, the north wall roses had been brought back to something that would survive the winter and come back right in the spring. Margaret came to the cottage door to assess the result and gave it a long look and said, "Acceptable," which from Margaret was considerable praise. "Acceptable," Nathan said, standing back and looking at it. "After all season. Acceptable is what you get," Margaret said, "when you wait until October." She looked at Clara. Her sharp dark eyes carried something that was warm and satisfied and entirely composed. "Come inside. I've had tea made." Clara looked at Nathan. Nathan looked at Clara. "She had tea made," he said. "She knew we'd be coming in. She always knows," Clara said. "That is an unsettling quality. You've had 30 years to get used to it." And yet, Margaret's voice came from inside the cottage. "I can hear you both, and I am not waiting." They went inside, and the October light settled over the garden, and the roses on the north wall stood properly pruned and properly tended for the first time all season. And the iris beds held their ground along the south wall, where Clara had reclaimed them month by month, and the lavender they'd argued about for 6 entire weeks stood where it had always stood. In the slightly overcrowded bed with the southern exposure, exactly as it had been before any of this started, and exactly as it should be. Some things, Clara had always believed, grew best where they were planted. Winter came to Richmond the way it always did, not all at once, but in degrees, the warmth pulling back a little more each week, until one morning you woke up and the cold was simply there, settled and permanent. And you understood that the season had changed while you weren't watching. Clara noticed it on a Tuesday in November, when she walked to the shop in the early morning, and her breath made small clouds in front of her face, and the Merchant Street cobblestones were slick with the kind of frost that looked thin, but wasn't. She noticed it, and she pulled her coat tighter, and she kept walking, and she thought about the garden, about whether the iris beds had been properly mulched before the freeze, about the lavender that was, according to her last inspection, handling the transition with the stubbornness she had come to expect from it. She thought about Nathan. She was allowing herself to do that now, without immediately redirecting the thought towards something practical. It had taken deliberate practice. She was getting better at it. He had been to the shop twice since the Thursday at the North Wall Roses. Not to buy anything, he had been transparent about that, in a way that made Ruth press her lips together, to suppress something. He had come because he wanted to see her, which he said directly, without framing it as anything else, which was so contrary to the way most men operated that it had taken Clara a moment to fully process it the first time. The first visit he had stayed 20 minutes, and they had talked about the road legislation that had finally passed in the Assembly, after 3 stalled sessions, and about a book she'd mentioned in September that he had read in the intervening time and had opinions about, and about Margaret's progress, which was slow but real. The second visit, he had stayed longer, and they had talked about less specific things, or perhaps more specific things, depending on how you measured, about what she wanted for the shop. What she saw when she thought 5 years ahead, whether she had ever thought about expanding. He had listened to her answers with that full quality of attention she'd known for months, and he had asked questions that showed he'd actually heard what she said. And at the end of it, he had stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand and said, simply, "May I come again Thursday?" "You come on Thursdays to the cottage," she said. "I come on Thursdays to the cottage," he agreed. And I would like to come here as well. She had looked at him for a moment. All right, she said. He had nodded and put his hat on and left, and Ruth had emerged from the back room with the expression of a woman who had been listening to every word and had absolutely no apology for it. Well, Ruth said. Don't, Clara said. I wasn't going to say a word. You were going to say several. I was going to say, Ruth said, with dignity, that I have known you for 11 years and I have never once seen a man make you smile at the door after he left. Clara turned back to her work table. I didn't smile. You did, Ruth said. You always do, when you think no one's looking. She sat down and picked up her own work. It's a very good smile, Clara. You should let it happen more. The talk in Richmond had not stopped. Clara had never expected it to stop. Talk in Richmond did not stop. It simply shifted shape and moved to a different register. What had changed was its character. Before, the talk had been speculative and slightly cruel, the kind talk that assumed the worst about a woman's motives and dressed that assumption in the language of concern. Now it was something different, uncertain. The people who had been most willing to believe Gerald Ashford's version of events had been confronted, publicly and without heat, by Nathaniel Caldwell's version, and by the quiet fact of the lease renewal, and by Vivian Ashford's visible withdrawal from the position she'd been holding. That last one mattered more than Clara had anticipated. Vivian had not made a public statement. She had not needed to. What she had done was stop. She had stopped attending the social events where the story about Clara's supposed Aiken had been circulated. She had stopped being in the rooms where her father's version of events was being affirmed. She had, by her absence, removed the endorsement that had been sustaining the narrative, and without that endorsement the narrative had begun, slowly, to lose its footing. Clara heard this from Mrs. Delaney, who tracked these things with the thoroughness of a naturalist studying migration patterns. People follow the Ashford girl, Mrs. Delaney said, on a Wednesday afternoon when she'd come in to collect her winter order. They always have. She sets a tone. When she stopped setting that particular tone, she lifted one shoulder. The room changed. I didn't expect her to do that, Clara said. I imagine she surprised herself, Mrs. Delaney said. She's not what her father made her, that girl. She's something else entirely. She just needed someone to point at the door. Clara thought about the parlor of the Ashford house. The pale green dress, the light blue eyes that had been sharper than they first appeared. I didn't point at anything, she said. I just told her the truth. Sometimes, Mrs. Delaney said, picking up her package, that's all a door needs. The Tuesday before Thanksgiving, a letter arrived at the shop that was not from Margaret. It was from Gerald Ashford. Clara read it standing at the counter, and she read it 3 times because the first 2 times she was not certain she was reading it correctly. It was short. It was in its way remarkable. It acknowledged, without using the word apology, and without precisely using the words wrong or mistake, that his visit to her shop in October had been conducted with motivations that were, his word, misaligned with the facts of the situation. It acknowledged that Miss Whitmore's conduct toward the Caldwell family had been, as far as could be determined, entirely without calculation. It stated that the Merchant Street lease matter had been resolved to everyone's satisfaction. And then, at the bottom, in handwriting that was slightly different from the careful formal script of the rest of the letter, slightly looser, slightly less managed, 2 additional sentences. My daughter spoke to me at some length on this matter. I find that I was not hearing her as clearly as I should have been. That was all. Clara folded the letter, put it in the drawer with the lease renewal and her father's deed. Then she sat down, right there behind the counter, which she never did, because there was always work to be done, and sitting behind the counter in the middle of the day was not practical. She sat down, and she thought about Vivian Ashford in that parlor, choosing to be her own person rather than her father's campaign. She thought about what it cost to turn toward a father you loved and tell him he was wrong. She thought about how Gerald Ashford, for all his pressure and all his methods, had loved his daughter enough to hear her when she finally spoke. People were not simple. She had always known this. But knowing it and seeing it were different things. She thought she might in time have some respect for Gerald Ashford. Not yet, but in time. She put the thought away and went back to work. She told Nathan about the letter on Thursday. He read it twice, the same way she had, and his face went through several things. What settled was something quieter and more thoughtful than she'd expected. She got to him. He said, "Yes, I've been trying to get to Gerald Ashford through various channels for 6 years," he said. "On various matters. He has never once," he stopped. His daughter walks in and has something, and he writes this letter. "He loves her," Clara said. "That's leverage. That doesn't look like leverage from the outside." Nathan looked at the letter. Then he looked at Clara. "You knew that. I suspected it. You walked into that house and you trusted it." "I trusted her," Clara said. "There's a difference." He folded the letter and handed it back to her carefully, like something that had weight. "What are you going to do with it?" "Nothing," she said. It said what it needed to say. That's enough. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that she had finally, after months, found a name for. It was not admiration exactly, though it contained that. It was not love exactly, though it contained that too. It was the expression of a man who had stopped being surprised by her and started simply seeing her, all of her, completely, without the effort of adjustment. "Clara," he said. "Don't make it sentimental," she said. "I just read a man's letter correctly. It's not remarkable." "It is," he said. "You are, and I'm going to keep saying so regardless of your feelings about sentiment." She looked at him. "I have perfectly good feelings about sentiment. In the appropriate place and proportion." "And what is the appropriate proportion?" "Enough to mean it," she said. "Not so much it loses its honesty." He was quiet for a moment. "Then I want to ask you something." "All right." He set down the trowel he'd been holding, straightened, faced her with the full, undivided quality of attention that she had come to understand was simply how he was made, all or nothing, present or absent, no managed middle distance. "I want to speak to Ruth Harding," he said. Clara went still. "About what?" "About you," he said. "About my intentions toward you. About what I would like, what I am hoping." He stopped. "Steady. I want to do this correctly. I told you that at the wall." "I meant it, Nathan. I know it's not simple," he said. "I know the distance between Caldwell Manor and Merchant Street is not just geography. I know there are 100 things to navigate, and I know some of them will be unpleasant, and I know that the people who have opinions about what is appropriate are not going to stop having them, simply because we'd like them to." He met her eyes. "I know all of it. I'm asking anyway." Clara looked at him. At the garden around them, which she had been tending since August, which had become as familiar as her own workroom, more familiar in some ways because it held more of her, more of the person she was when nobody was measuring. "Ruth is going to say yes before you finish asking," Clara said. "I know," he said, "but it should still be asked." She looked at him for a long moment. The man who handed her tools and thought before he spoke and stayed past his business and kept his word and had never once, in 8 months of Thursdays, tried to make her smaller to fit a space that was easier for him. "All right," she said. "Come for supper on Friday." "I'll make sure she's there." The smile that crossed his face was the real one. It went all the way up. He came for supper on Friday. Ruth had been at the shop all day and had spent approximately none of that time pretending she wasn't aware of what the evening was, which meant she had also spent approximately none of it pretending her feelings about it were neutral. By the time Nathan arrived at 6, she had made enough food for 8 people and set the table with the good cloth and was wearing her better dress, all of which she had clearly decided was simply how Friday evenings went now. Nathan ate 2 full plates and told Ruth the soup was the best he'd had in Virginia, which was either true or excellent strategy. And Ruth told him it was her mother's recipe, and that she'd been making it for 30 years. And they talked about her mother's recipe for 20 minutes, with a degree of genuine mutual interest that Clara observed from across the table, with something she could only describe as warmth. He asked Ruth about the shop, about the history of it, about when Clara's father had started it and how Clara had come into it, and what it had taken to keep it going in the difficult years. He asked the way he asked everything, genuinely, with follow-up questions that showed he was listening to the answers and not just waiting to speak. Ruth answered him the same way, with the complete honesty she had always applied to things that mattered. She told him about the difficult years without softening them. She told him about Clara at 19, making decisions that should not have fallen to a 19-year-old. She told him things that Clara had not told him herself, not because she'd been hiding them, but because Ruth had observed them from outside, in a way Clara couldn't. Clara listened to Ruth describe her and felt the strange, doubled sensation of being known, not presented, not managed, but simply known, the way you are known by people who have watched you for years and have seen all the versions. The capable ones and the frightened ones, and the ones that happened at 6 in the morning before anyone else was awake. Nathan listened to all of it and did not shift and did not qualify and did not make any of the small adjustments that people sometimes made when information arrived that complicated the picture they'd been building. He just took it in. When Ruth had said what she had to say, he looked at Clara just once, briefly, and then he said to Ruth, directly, "I intend to conduct myself toward Clara in a way that is worthy of her. I am aware of what that means, and I am aware of what it requires. I am not asking you for a permission that isn't yours to give. But I am asking for your regard, your good opinion. Because she values yours above most." Ruth looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up her wine glass and said, "You have it." And that was that. The twist came in December, and it came from a direction none of them had prepared for. Margaret called them both to the cottage on a Wednesday, not a Thursday, not their ordinary day. A Wednesday, and when Clara arrived, she found Nathan already there and Margaret in her chair with a small stack of papers in her lap and an expression that Clara had not seen before. Not the dry wit, not the managed composure. Something underneath both of those, something older and more serious. "Sit down," Margaret said, "both of you." They sat. "I have been speaking with my solicitor," Margaret said. "And I have made some decisions. I want you both to hear them from me directly, before they go any further." Nathan was very still across from Clara. She could feel it without looking at him. "The cottage," Margaret said, "and the 3 acres attached to it. I am leaving to you, Clara." She held up one hand before either of them could speak. "Let me finish. I am not doing this because of Nathaniel. I am not doing this as an arrangement or an incentive or as any kind of bridge between your two circumstances. I am doing this because this garden," she paused. "This garden has not been alive in 20 years, not truly. And you brought it back. That is yours. It was always going to be yours. I simply needed to make it official." The room was very quiet. Clara started. I said, "Let me finish." Her voice was not harsh, but it was firm in the way bedrock is firm. "Nathaniel will have the main estate and the responsibilities that come with it, as was always intended. This cottage and this garden are separate. They have always been separate. They are mine to dispose of as I choose, and I choose this." She looked at Clara steadily. "You came through that gate 8 months ago because an old woman needed help and you did not walk past. That is the kind of person who should tend this garden for the rest of her life. I am simply making sure that happens." Clara's hands were pressed flat on her knees. She could feel the pressure of her own palms, the physical reality of the moment, because without something solid to hold, she was not entirely certain of the ground. "I don't know what to say," she said. "You don't have to say anything," Margaret said. "It's done. My solicitor has the papers." She looked at Nathan. Well, Nathan had been watching Clara while Margaret spoke. He was watching her still. He looked at Margaret. "I think," he said carefully, "that you have managed, from that chair, to be several steps ahead of everyone else in this county for the duration of this entire situation." "I usually am," Margaret said. "I think," he continued, "that you have given Clara something that cannot be complicated by anything that happens between her and me, which means she will always have ground that is entirely hers, regardless of how any of the rest of this resolves." "Yes," Margaret said, "which means you have also given her a reason to trust that all of this is not about obligation or circumstance." "Also yes." He looked at his grandmother for a long moment. Then he said, simply, "Thank you." Margaret settled back in her chair with the expression of a woman who had done what she set out to do and was not interested in being thanked for it. "There is tea," she said. "I suggest someone make it." Clara walked home from the cottage that Wednesday evening in the December cold, and she let herself feel everything the magnitude of what Margaret had given her, not just the land and the cottage and the garden, but the thing underneath it. The ground that was hers, the gate that would always open. She thought about the night in July, the rain and the mud and the broken basket. She thought about the choice she hadn't really made consciously, the choice that had just been her, responding to a sound in the dark, the way she always responded to things that needed responding to, without calculation, without strategy, just with the simple fact of herself. She had not been trying to change her life that night. She had been walking in the rain toward music and candlelight, hoping, in some quiet part of herself she didn't examine too closely, that the evening might matter. And then she had heard a sound, and she had turned toward it, and everything else had followed from that turning, naturally and irreversibly, the way one thing always leads to another when you are living honestly. The shop was lit when she got back. Ruth was still up, working at the table by lamplight, and she looked up when Claire came in and read the whole evening in Clara's face the way she always read things. "Well," Ruth said. "Margaret Holloway," Clara said, sitting down across from her, "is the most remarkable woman I have ever met." "What did she do?" Clara told her. Ruth set down her work and listened and did not say a word until Clara was finished. Then she put both hands flat on the table and looked at Clara with an expression that was composed of several things at once: wonder and gladness, and something that was simply love, the long-built kind that doesn't require ceremony. "Your father would have been so proud of you," Ruth said. Clara looked at her. Her throat did the thing she didn't let it do in front of people. "He would have said I was being impractical," she managed. "He would have said that, and then been proud," Ruth said. "He was always proudest of the impractical things you did." They sat together in the quiet of the shop for a while, the lamplight warm between them, the cold outside doing what December cold did, and it was enough. It was more than enough. Spring came to Virginia on a Saturday. Not officially, it was still March, still technically winter, still the kind of morning that needed a coat. But in the garden at the cottage, the iris beds that Clara had reclaimed from neglect the previous summer were pushing green shoots through the soil with the particular determination of things that had been growing in the dark all winter and were done waiting. Clara was on her knees in the dirt when she heard the gate. She knew his step, had known it since August. "They're coming up," she said, without turning around. Nathan came to crouch beside her. He looked at the chutes, then at her face, then at the chutes again. "The whole bed," he said. She sat back. "I wasn't sure. After the hard freeze in January, I wasn't sure they'd all make it. But they did. They did." She looked at the row of green pushing through the dark earth, certain and unhurried and exactly where she'd put them. "Some things don't need much," she said. "Just the right ground and enough time." He was quiet beside her. She felt him looking at her the way he always looked at her, fully, without reservation, the look that had taken her months to stop deflecting and simply receive. "Clara," he said. I've been thinking about the spring assembly." She raised an eyebrow without looking at him. "You hate the spring assembly." "I hate it when I go alone," he said. "I would like to go with you." She turned to look at him then. He met her eyes without any management in it, just the clean, direct fact of what he was saying. "Publicly," she said. "Yes. Together. Yes. You understand what that means," she said. "In this county, people will have opinions," he said. "Yes. They will have opinions from now until the end of time, Clara. They had opinions when I stood at the Patterson gathering and said your name. They had opinions when the lease was renewed. They will always have opinions." He held her gaze. "I find I am significantly less interested in their opinions than I am in the fact that I would like to walk into a room with you and not pretend we are something other than what we are." "And what are we?" she asked. He looked at her steadily. People who argued about lavender for 6 weeks and then the roses for the rest of the season, and who are, I strongly suspect, going to be arguing about this garden for a very long time. A pause. And people who have chosen each other, honestly, without calculation. In front of whatever audience shows up. Clara looked at him. At this garden that was hers now, officially, legally, entirely. At the iris beds coming back after a hard winter. At the lavender in its slightly overcrowded bed with the southern exposure where it had always been. At the roses on the north wall, properly tended at last, coming back in the direction she'd trained them. At the man beside her, who had stayed 8 weeks past his business, and had kept his word and had fought for her name without being asked and had listened, genuinely listened. When she told him who she was and what she needed, and had not once asked her to be less. She thought about the gate, the iron gate, half hidden by ivy, that she had not noticed until the night she needed it. The gate that had always been open. All right, she said. The spring assembly. He nodded, looked back at the iris shoots. They were both quiet for a moment, the good kind of quiet, the kind that has substance to it. The roses, he said, are going to need attention before April. I know, she said. We should look at the south bed too. The drainage wasn't right last fall. I fixed the drainage in February. He looked at her. When? The Wednesday after the freeze. The ground was soft enough. She picked up her trowel. You weren't here. You came alone in February and fixed the drainage. The drainage needed fixing. He shook his head, slowly, with an expression that had moved past exasperation and arrived somewhere warmer. You are the most relentlessly capable, she said. You said so in October. I was understating it. I know, she said. Get the second trowel. There's still work to do. He got the second trowel and came back, and they worked side by side in the March morning, in the garden that was hers now, in the ground she had chosen and been given and earned all at once. And somewhere behind them Margaret Holloway's voice came through the cottage window with a comment about the south bed drainage that suggested she had an opinion about Clara's February repair work, and intended to share it. And Nathan caught Clara's eye over the iris shoots, and she looked away before the laugh could happen, and then let it happen anyway. It rang out across the garden, clear and unguarded and entirely her own. And in Virginia, in the spring of 1818, in a garden reclaimed from neglect by a woman who had simply walked toward a sound in the dark and refused to walk past it, Clara Whitmore knelt in the earth of her own ground. Beside the man she had chosen as honestly as she had ever chosen anything, and understood, without any ceremony or any audience, that she had not found this life by chasing it. She had found it by being, completely and without apology, exactly herself. And that was the truest and the best and the most unassailable thing she had ever owned.